grief is not something you get over. Okay. Person dies, you grieve, and then you move on. Grief is something you move through, and it's for the rest of your life.
Hi there, grief growers. I am so grateful to be here with you as always. If you've been growing alongside me in my work for a while, welcome back. And if you are new to me and my work, hello. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I am a grief coach, 3-time author, and the founder of Life After Loss Academy, where I have helped dozens of grieving people stop feeling lost, stuck, broken, and alone, and start building lives that they genuinely love from the lives that loss forced them to live. This includes not only death-related losses, but also losses like divorce and breakup, major diagnosis, and every other type of loss that changes your life. Here on Grief Grower, we believe that grief is not something we get over. It is something that we grow with and alongside, and that when we stop treating grief like a problem to be solved and start treating it like an invitation to live more deeply, we can create meaningful lives that are rich with the memories we carry, the struggles that we faced, and the preciousness of what it means to be right here and right now. Today on the show, I'm bringing you my conversation with Gordon Brewer. Together, we talked about caregiving as a form of surrender, especially for men who are often expected to fix things in our society, how grief can change your relationship to God and religion, and what to do if you're sitting in the pain or uncertainty of a life that you never would have asked for. Here is Gordon's bio. Gordon Brewer is the person behind the Practice of Therapy podcast and a licensed marital and family therapist. He has 20 plus years in the mental wellness and grief recovery fields. He is the owner of a small group practice in Kingsport, Tennessee. Gordon is also a widowed person and knows firsthand the impact of grief on people's lives. Let's get to our conversation. Grief growers, I am so delighted today to introduce you to Gordon Brewer, who is the host of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Gordon, tell us more about your loss story, your relationship to grief, and how you got here.
Wow, that's a great question, and I'll try to shorten it as best I can. But one of the things about me before I became a therapist was I worked in the funeral industry. I was a funeral director and also an embalmer. I worked in that for almost 20 years, and then went back to graduate school, got my degree in counseling, just mainly because I wanted to do more to help people. I felt like just walking people through a funeral is helpful, but I wanted to do more in depth and learn how to do therapy. And I had majored in psychology in college. And then fast forward to 2010, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so went through all the ups and downs of that over 13 years. It metastasized to her brain, and then she passed away in 2023. And so, going through that with my daughter as well. When my wife was first diagnosed with cancer, my daughter was just going into high school. And it was also when I was making a transition from working in the nonprofit sector for an organization that worked with at-risk children and youth. I went into private practice at that time. So, but also, as we had talked about previously, Shelby, it was one of the things that during my tenure in the funeral business is I really got interested in grief and grief therapy and just helping people with grief. And it was really at a time period where the whole phenomenon of people really acknowledging grief and how we handle grief was coming more into the forefront. I think it's interesting how grief has been kind of under the surface the whole time. And then going through my own grief with my wife's death and being a caregiver and the ups and downs of that. And then I do supervision with some therapists that are working towards licensure. So I just love talking about grief and working with grief. That sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but I really am passionate about it.
I love that. Well, and here it's not a weird thing to say, but like if you go
Right.
out in the world and say, "I love talking about grief," people look at you like you have two heads. But
Yeah.
here it's absolutely not a strange thing to say. I think
Right.
the first place I want to go is my brain went back to 2010 and the moment of your wife's diagnosis. And I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people who are listening to this podcast, caregivers, have been caregivers as a part of their grief experience, but especially from a spouse or a loved one's perspective, I think in our society we say in marriage and like in sickness and in health and all these commitments
Mm-hmm.
we make to each other. And
Right.
at the moment of her diagnosis, was there a conversation between the two of you of what is this about to be? Who are we about
Mm-hmm.
to become? Or was it, well, we're getting on the roller coaster and we'll see what happens, which is also
Mm-hmm.
a very valid point to take. And as parents,
Mm-hmm.
how did you fold your daughter into the conversation of the experience of what was happening? So kind of take us through, if you could, from the moment of diagnosis, and then like how was there any idea of what the next 13 years would become with each
Right.
other?
I think what we all do when we're faced with a potentially terminal illness, the type of breast cancer that she was diagnosed with was had like a 5-year life expectancy. I did looked it up. The doctors didn't tell us that, and so I just kind of took it on myself to kind of find out, okay, what are we up against here? And I think, even though I'm a grief expert, so to speak, when you're going through it yourself, it's a totally different animal. You just get into, as I like to call it, just go mode. You go through the different things and say, okay, we're going to figure this out. And my wife and I talked about that some. I think to some degree she was a little bit in denial about what was happening to her, which I get. Um, Most people in kind of the grief world know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross when she was kind of the first
Mm-hmm.
person to really talk about stages of grief, which when they interviewed Elizabeth later on, she said she wished she hadn't have put it in stages because grief is not 1, 2, 3 linear thing. It's a mixture of things, and
Right.
so, but she had written it about people, really written it about people who were being diagnosed with a potentially terminal illness. Of
Yes.
course, of course, at the time when she was diagnosed, we were given a good bit of hope in that, okay, we're going to be able to do these things. And she had a double mastectomy to kind of, okay, we're going to nip it in the bud. Her her cancer was at a stage 3, I think, whatever. But you kind of mentally prepare for the worst. I think when
Mm-hmm.
you get the news, you think, okay, what do I need to do? And that might be more of a male perspective on grief, and there's something I need to do, something I need to do to fix this. I need to conquer this. I need to protect this. I need to whatever. And what happens, I think, is that I think a lot of for men, especially, they might feel like they have failed at something because they haven't been able to protect their loved one from this or their spouse from this. And so, yeah, and so that's part of the phenomenon there. But then, you go through the initial treatment, the surgery, and then she had radiation. She had chemo, then radiation treatment, and they think, okay, we're all good. She's clear. The last scans didn't show any more cancer. And then you go back, and so you're living from scan to scan essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like every 2 years she'd go for her scan, and there'd be a hot spot that would show up, and so they'd go in and take care of that. She had another. She had to have another surgery for a removing some lymph nodes that they discovered that had were cancerous, and so they removed those, and then more radiation treatment, and then at her work, she started complaining about not being able to see things peripherally. She was having trouble with her peripheral vision. And she actually went to her eye doctor, an optometrist, and he said, well, I don't know what it is. It's probably nothing. And, just kind of minimized it. Well, that was the first signs of her brain tumor. And
Oh,
so
wow.
it had metastasized to her brain. And then she was at work, and she totally blanked out and passed out, and they had to call the ambulance, and I was struggling to get there and figure out what was going on. And basically the doctors at the time were kind of, well, we're not going to treat her. They were treating it like, oh, well, this is going to be terminal, so we're not going to take her kind of
Wow.
thing, was what I read between the lines. But fortunately, her doctor advocated for her and got her to Kingsport. And we were very fortunate that it happened to be when she got there. There was also a neurosurgeon that was there, friends of the oncologist, and they got her into surgery within 2 days. And so, of course, at that point, you're thinking, okay, brain tumor, this is it. You get yourself prepared mentally, and you think, okay, how am I going to do this? Get my daughter prepared. She had just started college. So, I mean, I was communicating with her, and she's trying to figure out, do I need to come home? All this kind of stuff. And you just go into this kind of this zone of, okay, I'm going to go through the motions here and do all the things to, make this work. And so then fast forward, she, after they did the surgery, fortunately it was on the surface of her brain, and they were able to get to it easily. And didn't seem like it had spread into the brain anywhere. It was kind of encapsulated. But at the time, they said, okay, we want to do whole brain radiation to make sure we got everything. And they kind of told us, well, these are things that can happen with that. And in hindsight, I think we probably both would have said, no, let's not do that. But essentially what it does is it literally zaps your brain. And so her brain began to atrophy, get smaller. And so it created dementia and just a slow deterioration of her brain over time. And then dealing with the other hot spots. In the last 2 or 3 years, she was wheelchair bound, had to have caregivers in the home. And I think when you're in the middle of that as a caregiver, you don't really, at least for me, I didn't realize how bad it really was. I mean, just how much I was taking on and really trying to navigate all that. And then there's that we could spend a whole episode just talking about how it changed my relationship with her. When you go from being a spouse to being a caregiver, it's like they're no longer your spouse. It's like you're taking care of a parent or a grandparent or a child or something. And so there was probably a lot in addition to the anticipatory grief. In other words, expecting the worst and kind of going through the grieving process ahead of time. There's also that detachment of, okay, I'm in caregiver mode now. I no longer have a spouse. I have someone I'm caring for. It's interesting how, as a therapist, I get a lot of people that are going through the same thing, which I love working with people like that. But I know even in my own therapy, that was a big thing that I had to deal with, is the guilt feelings of, well, I no longer feel the same way about her. I no longer feel any sort of romantic feelings or any of that sort of thing. And, come to find out, that's pretty typical for people that are in a long-term caregiving situation with a spouse, and that all of that changes. One of the things about me is I'm also a clergy person in the Episcopal Church. And so the whole existential crisis of, okay, why is God letting this happen? Well, of course, I don't want to go down another rabbit track. I don't think that's how God works, but dealing with all of that, it's still something I still process, here 2.5 years later after her death.
I just wrote down, because one of my intentions in having you on the show was talking about caregiving, and then also talking about grieving as a man in our society, where it's not okay to show emotion, or you need to be strong for your family, or all these stories that we tell our men and our boys when grief enters the room. And I wrote down, caregiving seems to be a practice of continual surrender. And then I wrote down, as a man. And to your point earlier about caregiving is often a situation where you are unable to fix or unable to protect or unable to save the day, for lack
Right.
of better
Right.
phrasing.
Mm-hmm.
You must continually be surrendering to uncertainty, more
Mm-hmm.
news, changing of the roles, changing of the structure of your relationship, even changing of how you see yourself. Can you talk about what it's like, or what it was like and what it is like to be at that intersection of I am a man who is caregiving, and
Mm-hmm.
what it's like kind of from a societal perspective, but what it's like from a personal perspective too.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much that you juggle because I was still running my therapy practice. I was still, seeing clients and doing my best to be present for them, which I felt like I did pretty well. But I think as much as anything, what I learned from all of this is the necessity of learning how to draw on supports. And I
Mm.
think that's one of the things that, to kind of pat myself on the back as I allowed myself to do. I gave myself permission to use supports. And also, being a therapist is making sure I'm doing my own therapy. And so I
Mm.
think that helped, that went a long way in just working with my therapist at the time, just with all the internal feelings and all the, the, that there. But I think as much as anything, men want to fix. We want to divide and conquer, and get through the problem and get this over with, and let's move on to the next thing. And so I think from my own experience, I felt a lot of that. I just, there were times I said, I just want this to be over. I just, I just want to be done with this. This is just I feel like my whole life is on hold. I'm taking care of my wife that's got dementia. She's, just all of those things. Um, it's like I almost felt like I was being, uh, forced into something I didn't want to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, yeah, it sounds like a lot like grief.
Yeah. Right.
Forced into a life you didn't want to live. Yeah,
Right. Right.
absolutely.
Right. And so, yeah. And so being getting to a place where you accept it, um, reminding myself to do, as cliche as it sounds, take a day at a time and just focus on the now, rather than, when I'm doing therapy with people is that a lot of times we can get either preoccupied with the past. I wish I would have. I wish I did. And that kind of takes people into this place of depression and, self-loathing and all that kind of stuff. The opposite of that is going to a place of what if, how could this be, anticipatory, anticipating things, creating a lot of anxiety for ourselves. And neither one of those places we have control of. All we
Hmm.
have control of is the present. And so really learning how to, instead of just reacting to things, learning how to respond to things and reminding myself of that. Now, it got ugly. I tell you, I know all the book stuff, but
Hmm.
I lost my temper. I got frustrated. You know, um, there was a lot of anger there, a lot of resentment, all of those kinds of things that again are, I think, a normal part of anticipatory grief, especially, and just the anxiety around that. What's my life going to be like? Am I going to be alone forever? But on the same time, juxtaposition that to, okay, I'm ready to start a new life. I'm ready to move on from this kind of thing, which part of the anticipatory grieving process kind of gets you to that point. And fast forward to when she did die, it was in many ways not a traumatic in the sense that we had hospice involved, but you know, um, people that have been around people that are dying, they can get to a point where they're doing what is referred to as agonal breathing, where they can,
Oh, sure.
yeah, yeah. And so that's when it's important to have a hospice involved and being able to take advantage of the medications to kind of keep their body well. I was afraid of over medicating her, and I didn't give her enough, and so she was struggling to breathe, and that was just traumatic. And so that's something I still work through. I'm still working through. Is just that the whole traumatic part of that. it's not the same kind of trauma as like the big T trauma, but it's still, traumatic to watch that happen. And then, just seeing her in a way kind of felt like she was suffering, even though hospice reassured me that she wasn't. But yeah, all the little pieces of all of it, it will take me a lifetime to process all of that. Grief is not something you get over. Okay. Person dies, you grieve, and then you move on. Grief is something you move through, and it's for the rest of your life. And so being able to accept that and just allowing yourself to have those moments where you just fall apart and ride the wave, as I like to say. And yeah, and you make it through it.
Yeah. And we talk a lot in my online course and community called Life After Loss Academy about grief as a lifetime companion and not as an obstacle or a boulder or a dictator or something that's, ruining your life for a season or that you need to get over. It's something that moves into the house and never leaves.
Right.
And it can look different across time, and you engage with it differently over time and with different losses and more experience and different tools and different stages of your life. But it never really goes away. And so I see that echoed in your experience. Something that keeps coming to me as you're speaking is talking about being a counselor, being in therapy, even having been a funeral director. And you're like, even then, like, this was still hard. And I didn't expect to go here today, but there's an assumption that people in the grief space or who talk about grief regularly are good at grief. I'm putting air quotes around this. But I often tell people, like, it's not that we're good at grief or that we're better at grief. We just know more. We just have tools. We just have language for it. It doesn't make us suffer less. So can you say more, not just about being a man and not just being about a caregiving spouse, but can you say more about grieving as a grief professional in terms of did people think you needed support and offer support, or did people think you knew everything and just left you to your own devices? Like, what was the perception of like, oh, well, you do this for your job, so this must be on some level easier for you, I think is a cultural assumption we have about people who are professionals who are also grieving at the same time.
Well, I think it's, as I mentioned, drawing on support, and that doesn't mean everybody supports you. You have your kind of your inner circle of friends and family that you can talk to about it. And the greatest thing anybody can do in helping somebody with grief is just to listen. I like to say God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and that we're our job is just to listen and to hear and acknowledge. And so fortunately, I had those people in my life. And being an expert, as you mentioned, doesn't take the pain away. And it's not that it diminishes the pain, but I think what it does do, as you mentioned, is gave me a language and also helped me to be mindful. Okay, this is what's happening to me right now. Grief lives under the surface, and it always lives under the surface. Good example of this. I went to a music festival this past weekend, Merle Fest, in Western North Carolina, in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. And one of my favorite groups that I got to hear was called the Kruger Brothers. And they have a song called Carolina in the Fall. And so that song always reminds me of my wife, and it always brings back all kinds of memories for me. Of living in Cary, North Carolina, and just the fall time, which is my favorite time of year. And every time I have heard them sing that live, I just start weeping. And it's just, one of those things that just moves me. And it's kind of like, oh, this is great. And I think that's something that's, I think, important to really learn how to do is when those waves of grief come, is allowing them to come and recognizing that that is just like a release. And it's just like after that, it's kind of like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I needed that so much.
How do you, I love this example because I just went to a concert yesterday here in Chicago of one of my favorite composers for film doing some of his favorite some of his favorite scores, and my best friend who died in 2022 from COVID, they played at the concert the score of one of her favorite movies that we watched together. And I didn't expect them to play the whole thing. And the melody that they did, it was about 10-15 minutes long. It was a symphony. They did everything. And as each song came, I forgot what it sounded like in my memory. I kept trying to bring it to the front and it wouldn't come. And then as soon as the first few notes started playing, I was like, I see the whole scene. I see the whole movie. I see us painting our nails on Sunday afternoon, watching this movie together. And I was weeping in the nosebleed section of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And I love this permission to, that you give yourself to cry and to show emotion and to ride the grief wave and to let the release come out. And I wonder, for people that you're working with in therapeutic practice, how do you teach someone to do that? Because I think, for me, I know it's something that has come with practice and continued exposure to the world. Like, the world will show you stimuli that make you cry. Some people, I think, have the gift of being able to stuff it down and choose, am I going to lean into the tears now or not? And other people are just like, it's here, so I'm crying. But I wonder how in your practice and how even you've taught yourself, you've managed to teach others how to give themselves permission to grieve in that way, whether through tears or through something else. Crying's not for everybody, but how do you teach people, and how have you taught yourself to give yourself permission to grieve? Or is that something you always knew how to do?
Fortunately, I grew up in a family where my dad was a pastor. And so that was something, people's funerals and that kind of thing. And of course, working in the funeral business for the years that I did, was around that all the time. And so in many ways, maybe I'm in the unique privilege of just seeing grieving as being normal, and it's something that I became accustomed to. And I think, that's been part of it. I think the other part of it is just in my own life's experiences, when I've allowed myself to do that, it's like I wouldn't say it comes as a relief, but it's a release in a way, because I think we learn how to bury our emotions. And I think, as I mentioned before, grief lives under the surface. And I think a lot of times it will poke its head out and it'll do it by surprise. And here's a good example of this. I can't tell you how many times when I was working in the funeral business, people would come to a funeral, and it might be an acquaintance or something like that, and they would find themselves during the funeral just uncontrollably sobbing, at a funeral of somebody they barely knew, or somebody they had just a peripheral connection to. And invariably they would, apologize, and they'd say, I don't know why this is happening. I don't really know them. And I'd usually say, okay, who have you lost in your life that you haven't let yourself grieve already, or haven't given yourself permission to grieve? And so it's like when the stress of life, I like the image of, if you take a tea kettle and you put it on the stove and plug it up and turn the heat up, guess what? It's going to explode. But if you allow yourself to take the stopper out and just allow the steam to come off and the pressure to come off, that's maybe a healthier way to allow ourselves to grieve. And there's no perfect way to grieve. I mean, everybody, as I like to say, everybody has to grieve in their own way, in their own time. You find your path. But I think being able to, again, give yourself permission to find those people in your life that will just listen and that won't try to fix it for you or say all the stupid stuff that people say when people are grieving, to try to justify it or give it some kind of meaning or whatever. Sometimes grief is just meaningless. I mean, it's just no meaning to it at all. It just hurts and it sucks, and it's a bastard. I mean, it really is. And just being able to accept that you're going to move through it, and that you're not alone.
Yeah, I want to get into that for sure. The stupid things that people say kind of lit this up in my brain, but also something you said earlier about let me see if I can form a succinct question around this.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that you have a Christian faith, and one of the questions that you were asking during your wife's diagnosis and your caregiving experience for her is like, why this, why me? And one of the stupid things that people say is God never gives you more than you can handle,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a bunch of BS.
Mm-hmm.
I think he gives you more than you can handle and then some.
Yeah. Right.
But I also don't think that grief or loss is some sort of divine testing or punishment or things like that. But I wonder, for people who are listening who have faith or have lost faith, or for whom faith is a part of their grief experience, how has your faith and relationship to God changed with everything that you have learned and know about grief?
I think for me personally, and this is part of my own theology and faith, is that I don't think God is like this puppet master up there pulling the strings to orchestrate what happens in the world, to teach people lessons, to do all these things behind the scenes, so to speak. I just don't think God operates that way. But I do think that God understands. I think what has held me in it is this sense of not being alone, and that I'm understood, and that I'm validated in some way. And as I like to say, just like grief, using this is Christian vernacular, the Holy Spirit will catch you by surprise, and that you have this welling up of emotion within yourself. I can't prove to anybody the existence of God or prove that comes from God or whatever. That's just the language I've assigned to it. But that brings meaning to me and brings comfort. And so I think whatever path people are on with their religion, I think first of all, God is big enough to handle our questions of doubt, and I think God prefers doubters personally.
I love that.
I think for me to have a certainty about it is missing the point. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. God is in the midst of the uncertainty and the unknowing. And I don't think that God does anything out of some grand scheme or plan. And I know there'll be probably a lot of people that don't agree with me on that, but I think we do more harm when we try to minimize the pain that people have to God. That just sets us up for thinking of God as this, dictator in space that, controls what we do here on life. No, God gave us a free will. And so we deal with that.
Yeah, I longtime listeners of my work will know that when my mom died, my experience of God, or my belief of who God was, also died. Of like, if you're good enough,
Sure.
good things will happen. If you pray hard enough, good things will happen. And if you're bad enough, bad things will happen. Kind of the rewarder and the punisher of God. And so I love this this notion of like, God is in the uncertainty, God is in the unknown, and you know what else is in those places is grief. And this is entirely selfish, but I resonate so much more with a God who gets grief than a God who creates loss as a form of punishment for or divine judgment of things that we were doing. I would much rather be held in or believe in a world where God gets what it's like to suffer and lives in those spaces also. I did not think we would be here today, but I absolutely love that. I love it. I wonder, you haven't shared your wife's name with us, so I'd love to know, kind of as we wrap up, some of your favorite things about her, and ways that you continue to remember her, carry her forward, besides that song, Caroline in the Fall, other ways that she shows up for you still today as a symbol of grief being that thing that comes along with us for the ride.
And you're so kind to ask, and I think that's an important thing, is to be able to name the people and ask people, what was their name? Tell me about her or him or whatever. Her name, she had a unique name. Her proper name was Mary, but ever since she was little, she was referred to as sister. And so everybody knew her as sister. And so that's what I called her. All of her friends called her that. And, somebody asked me one time, well, who is this Sister Brewer? And somebody made a joke. Well, she's a nun that makes beer in the church, kind of thing. But yeah, that was her name. And before she got sick, she was a very gregarious, outgoing, fun-loving person. She was a lot of fun to be around. Everybody that knew her or was close to her just loved being around her. And so it was sad to see that fade away and for her to change in that way and really in many ways become really kind of bitter towards the end. But a lot of it was due to her own confusion about what was going on around her with the dementia. And she had gone through a lot of loss. She had lost her brother to suicide when she was in college. Her dad died shortly after we got married. And then when her mom died, she found her dead in her mom's kitchen. She was taking care of her mom. And so I know that she went through a lot of hurt and pain herself. And and so that was her. Yeah.
It seems like she was a person who knew a great amount of loss herself, and so you were grieving and caregiving for someone who was grieving and potentially caregiving for herself as a grieving person as well.
Right.
I know we talked about this. I don't know when each of our podcasts are going to air, but Grief Growers, you can go hear me on Practice of Therapy probably by the time this airs.
Yeah.
But we talked about in many seasons of our life, we are grievers and supporters all at the same time. And sometimes we are supporters of ourselves and we are grievers ourselves. And so it sounds like you two were both sort of in that cyclical nature. Sometimes we're grievers and supporters to each other, but sometimes we're grievers and supporters of ourselves as we are grieving and supporting each other. Yeah. I wonder, what are some other ways that you carry her forward today? Or maybe you notice or see her out in the world. Like, how does your relationship continue?
Yeah, I think as much as anything through my daughter, because we continue to talk about her and say, oh, I did a sister thing today. Or, I'll tell my daughter all the time when I see her do something, I'll say, you're just your mom. What's been great is that having an adult daughter and being able to have that life together afterwards. Sister is rolling in her grave because we did this, but my daughter and I went and got the same tattoo together. Let's see. Where is it there? Let's see. Let me turn my hand. So
I love it.
We've got a tattoo of a great blue heron, which to her has a lot of camp significance in that whenever they would see a great blue heron fly over the water at camp, the kids would say, that's the Holy Spirit coming to visit us. And so that's what it has become to represent for us. And every time we see a great blue heron, we text each other and say, I just saw a heron. And what it has come to mean for us is that a great blue heron will show up when we need it most. And so when we feel, might be going through a hard time or a rough day or whatever, a blue heron will show up. And so, that was something we did, not necessarily to honor my wife and her mom, but to honor ourselves and what we've been through with her as much as anything.
That's a beautiful way to phrase that, is in the same way that funerals are for the living. A lot of people like to say, I'm like, tattoos are for the living too, or memorials or rituals or anything that you do to carry your grief forward. Like, that's for you. It can be in remembrance of someone or something or relationship that was lost, but can also, and mostly, pardon me, but should be for how you need to continue living in a world where they are no longer here. And so whatever ritual you invent, whatever tattoo you get, I also have a grief tattoo, I have a few of them, whatever memorials you do, whatever actions you take, I this is a whole other conversation, but I don't like when people say they wouldn't want you to, or they would want you to. I'm like, no, You do have to live your life for yourself and do your grief memorials for yourself. And always, if it resonates with you, with the intention or with the inspiration of their presence behind it. I love that. I love the memorial tattoos. In the future, we'll do a whole episode on memorial tattoos. It'd be so fun.
Yeah.
Gordon, as we sign off for the day, I wonder, from your perspective as a therapist, as a grieving spouse, as a caregiver, a lot of people listening are just in the uncertainty right now, in the unknown of grief. What is one message or sign off that you could offer people who feel right now like, I'm in the middle of something that I don't even fully know or understand, and I can't see a way out? They're in that place in grief. I feel like you could uniquely speak to that.
First of all, this sounds just kind of dismissive. You just got to accept it. But there is something about acceptance of, okay, this is where I am right now, but also reminding yourself that this is a season and you will have many seasons of life, and that you will move through this. And again, to know that you're not alone in this. I mean, even for people listening to this podcast, they probably are getting a sense of, oh, I'm not the only one. And so it's just really important to reach out to those that you know can be of support to you. There's no perfect way to grieve. It's messy. It's sad. It's terrible. But at the same time, grieving can be liberating to some degree, and that there's a release to it that you can allow to happen. And it's, again, something you move through. And, I think the more you can educate yourself on just like listening to this podcast is educating yourself on what it means to grieve or what it's like to grieve. And I think having a language for it is an important piece as well. One of the other things too is, which I have, particularly through my wife's illness and there, I started journaling, and having that as an outlet. And nobody reads my journals. It's just for me, but it's something that I do every morning to just say, okay, this is what I'm experiencing right now. And just having a way to take what you're experiencing internally and put it out in front of you. And I think by doing that, to some degree, you can get a different perspective on it by allowing yourself to do that. Dr. Alan Wolfelt, one of my favorite quotes of his is he says, grief shared equals grief diminished. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that. And being able to find those people that you can share your grief with, not expecting them to fix it or take the pain away. But I think that's the way you make it through all of this.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to leave on. And yes, grief growers, anything that helps you feel seen or less alone in your grief. If you don't have the energy, the time, capacity, space to bring your grief to another person right now in this season, we talk about those prepositional phrases right now, even listening to other people's stories of grief and recognizing like, oh, there are others in this universe, there are others in my orbit who also know what it is to grieve and know what this means, can be supremely helpful. Gordon, thank you so much for coming on Grief Grower today and for speaking with us and sharing your grief with us.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a great experience.
That's all for this episode of Grief Grower. Thank you so very much for joining me and Gordon today. If you're looking for grief support beyond this show, you can find free workshops, blog articles, and my new What's Your Grief Supporter Strength quiz at shelbyforsythia.com/links. And if you'd like to get support from me for your unique loss experience, join us in Life After Loss Academy, my online course and community. As a student, I'll walk you through my 5-step grief framework for rebuilding after loss, and you can get live coaching from me every single week to answer your questions. Replays are always available if you can't attend live. It's just $33 a month to join, or $22 a month if you're a marginalized or financially stressed griever, and you can cancel your membership at any time. You can find a link to Gordon's work and his podcast, The Practice of Therapy, in the show notes for this episode. If this podcast felt validating, comforting, educational, or otherwise helpful to you, please subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Grief Grower is hosted by me, Shelby Forsythia, with theme music composed by Addie Goldstein. Until next time, Grief Growers, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.